Today, I'm excited to welcome Nicolas, who will be talking to us about the trouble with classroom management in the primary classroom. Nicolas is the Teacher Development Manager for Cambridge University Press for the Greater China region. So without further ado, over to you, Nick.
And good morning, good afternoon, or good evening from wherever you are joining us today. And today I will be talking about classroom management, some of the troubles we experience with it, in particular in the primary context. It's good to see so many people from all over the world. So I'm going to get you to do a little bit of typing in the chat box. Could you type how would you describe your young learners? So think about an adjective that best describes them and put it into the chat box. Okay, curious, energetic, pretty good, creative, positive, out of control. Alan, you are very honest. Noisy, funny, talkative, playful. Okay, so definitely saw a lot of the active, some lovelies, energetic, of course, maybe even a diligent, and also some naughty, perhaps shy, and at times learners can also be unsettled. And if we're lucky, we can get them very curious as well. That leads us to some of the common issues that we face with young learners. Sometimes our learners can be, a little bit not very attentive. Okay, so we can be in the classroom, presenting our grammar points, our vocabulary, and our students can just sit there and look like their mind is very far away. Oftentimes, we also get learners who are very talkative, but not at the times where we want them to be talkative. So, in the middle of a reading activity or an important listening stage, our learners decide then and there that that's the most important time to have a conversation with their desk mate. Yet in the speaking activity, they might be a little bit shy. With very young learners, we even have problems with them moving around the room. They might be a little bit energetic, and, they might run around, and we've got to control them, put them back in their desks. Sometimes learners can be disruptive even. They might just disrupting your lesson, or even worse, they could be to some extent mischievous on purpose. Okay, so they might be trying to disrupt your lesson. And on very rare occasions, we do find some learners who have a certain level of defiance of authority figures. So in the lesson, that would be you, the teacher. Okay, in certain regions, that's less of a problem. So the question is then, well, what's driving this? Why are our learners behaving this way? One of the big issues that could be driving this is communication issues. If you're from a different culture coming in and you don't speak the student's language natively, this could be an issue. Okay, there could be cultural issues, even within very big countries, going from one region to another, you might find differences. Motivation also plays a big role in learner behavior. There's oftentimes students are doing classes and they don't really know why. It's something that parents have signed them up for. My daughter, she does quite a few extracurricular classes, art, singing, dancing, acting. And she's not really keen on acting. Okay, she always tells me, I don't want to do it. It's boring. Like it's something her mother wanted her to do. Maybe learners have family or personal problems. Okay, is the learner's home environment good? Or maybe not. And this is having an effect on them in the lesson itself. Feelings of inadequacy. If learners feel that there's a big difference in their levels, okay, if they're sort of a weaker student in the lesson, they might recognize this fact and might be driving some behavioral problems. And sometimes, as teachers, we don't like to mention this, that sometimes it could be poor planning or preparation from ourselves, and this having a negative effect on our lesson and on the learner's behavior. So this puts us to think about what we do with classroom management. And if you ask this question, classroom management is very broad. You could argue that almost everything a teacher does has some level of implication. Now, maybe that's sometimes more, maybe that's sometimes less. I always think that having some rules and communicating these with students is a very effective tool. Okay, being very clear with our learners what we're looking for. Now, also the way we organize and decorate our rooms can affect classroom management. And this also might be how you arrange your desks or your chairs. Okay, so if learners are all sort of spaced out, that might control communication issues, but might have a negative effect on our ability to do group work. I understand that sometimes in some schools and some regions of countries that we're not always permitted as teachers to arrange desks or the classroom. Okay, I was recently teaching, and I was collecting learner work and displaying it, and the next day I would come back and it was all removed, which is a bit frustrating. The way we speak to children and deal with their responses and questions that they might have also has a great influence. Okay, are we talking to them in a way where they feel that we are recognizing their issues, or are we dismissing them? Okay, what about our facial expressions? How are we looking at the learners? Are we smiling with their questions, or do we have a scowl on our face? Okay, all these things, of course, the students are very perceptive at looking and reading. And of course, our routines, okay, how we implement these routines, how we modify them depending on the learner needs, and reinstituting them when needed. All of these things, of course, with routines are very important because learners will recognize the process in the lesson. Okay, they're very good at picking that up, and the better we are at keeping these routines, the better they are at transitioning through the different phases of a lesson and being able to know exactly what we want from them. Of course, our relationship and relationship management with our learners. If you had tuned in earlier today for Leslie's great talk, you would have heard a lot better explanation than what I can possibly give. So if you missed that, go to YouTube and check it out later. Fantastic. I quite like this quote. Learning can be considered work of the head and the heart. And this really resonated with me. And we've got to recognize with young learners, sometimes they don't actually place an intrinsic value in the subject matter or or the task that they're doing, particularly with very young learners and lower primary. They're sort of completing tasks, to see the happiness in the teacher. Okay, they're completing it to make sure, to please us as teachers, or to please their parents. And that's why, if you observe lots of lessons, you will see that the strict teachers can certainly manage a class in a certain sense. They can keep quiet, they can keep order. But these lessons become handicapped in a sense. And I think that if we do rule by fear, that we really limit our ability to connect with learners. So it's a bit of a balance, isn't it? We do want learners to feel that they can express themselves, but we don't want to, quote unquote, have an out of control lesson. But thinking about this sort of climb, okay, this balance, if you will, you cannot be, too likable, because you might lose respect and authority. If you're too funny, you can't be serious at times. If you're too nice, you can't enforce discipline. So you have to think about this balance. Okay, what's your teaching style, and where do you fit? If we go into a lesson and we are sort of unprepared, our learners can quickly pick that up. And I'll be honest, I've been in this situation before. It's a long summer. You're busy. You've got 8 hours of teaching, and you thought you'd cut some corners with your preparation, and you've gone into class, and you're shuffling your papers, trying to figure out what comes next. Your learners can pick that up very quickly. Okay, and they start getting uneasy. They start shuffling because you haven't gone to the task. And this stands in stark contrast to a lesson that goes smoothly and goes from one activity to the next. So it does seem obvious, but lesson planning is a vital first step. Now, that doesn't mean that we have to be married to our lesson plan, but we should be thinking about it. We should be thinking about our structure. We should be thinking about what problems might occur, what our learners will be doing, and how we transition. And this helps us to pick up any potential problems which could occur with our lesson. And the more you think about it, and the more you have some sort of plan, doesn't mean you have to have a whole script for your lesson, but this sort of frees you, counterintuitively, it frees you to be more flexible within your lesson. But there's some things we do have to keep standard. What are our objectives? Do our activities match our learning goals? Do we have a sufficient number of activities? There's nothing worse than finishing early and saying, we're going to do some review now. And it could also be simple things like our handouts. Do you have enough prepared? What happens if a learner comes extra? Will you be able to match them with another learner? What happens if our learners finish quickly? What happens if they don't understand? Okay. If we are not communicating clearly with instructions, sometimes this can create difficulties with classroom management. And this is why scaffolding and sequencing are important. Okay. And this could be a general question like, when is the lesson? Okay. Is it, after lunch? Do we have to factor, this in? Do we have the proper support to build up to an end production? If we're playing a song, do the learners know the key words? Is that important? Okay, or are we focusing on the structure of the chant, perhaps? And order of instructions. I mean, this seems like a small detail, but something like this can very much affect a learner's ability to understand and to know what we want from them. I'm a big believer in communicating why we are doing something with learners. So for instance, you might give the instructions for a task and then elicit from learners why they are doing the activity. So maybe it's to learn about the environment, to learn new words. And I like to remind them of the aim if necessary. Okay, so again, we are making these clear communications about what is expected in the lesson. And of course, this is critical to maintain an atmosphere which is conducive to learning. So I talked about earlier managing the environment, about how we might set up our desks or the class. And sometimes in a lesson, we might want to do this midway through. So you can make this a part of a lesson for your learners. So for example, you might ask learners to look around and before we start a task. Okay, so when we say, okay, guys, where's the dictionaries? Get them to look around, choose desk, one of the students from the desk to go get the dictionaries or something like this, or whatever props you might need for the activity. Okay, and you could also make them active in the arranging process of the desks. Okay, all these little things helps make them a part of the process. Okay, oftentimes, teachers can be a little bit nervous. They're trying to control everything and do this themselves. Okay, so when we're this nervous level, we are trying to do everything ourselves. Often this compounds, okay, and sort of evaporates from that rich environment we're trying to build. You've probably heard this one a lot, but we try to give tasks and identify who in the group will do what task. Okay, so after you've established it a little bit, you might get the learners to do this themselves, or perhaps if it's a new class that you've taken, you might give this. You might give a role for the group yourself. So, for example, one person might be a writer, one would collect materials, one will do the sticking, and of course, they will all be communicating together. It's always good to have not just give instructions orally, but to write it down. Okay, so there's a sort of visual for the learners as well. Okay, so for instance, in this activity, we can say, okay, one is the writer, one is runner, one is a reader. Okay, so they can see there's 3 clear goals for this running dictation task. All right, again, this task is collaborative, which is great. And you might give a brief description of what each role is doing. Okay, and of course we ask ICQs to double check. I also think for classroom management that it's very important that we link our instructions with the learners and make sure they're crystal clear about what needs to be done. Okay, again, with this theme of clear communication about what we expect. Okay, you can't be upset with learners when they're not doing something right or the way you wanted if you didn't communicate it clearly. Learners are not mind readers. So for instance, we might put the steps on the board. Okay, 1, 2, 3, 4. And under the steps, we would give the example. So you can see here, okay, writer reads the questions. That's step 1. Step 2, runner goes to the reader and tells them the question. Step 3, so on, so forth. Okay, this breakdown of the steps makes it very clear. And if needs be, you can also model this for the learners. Okay, modeling is very important as a teacher. You want to be demonstrating how it's done. Okay, it's much easier for young learners to see and to be able to follow. Yes, or a demo, that's right. Okay, modeling or demonstrating it. And of course, ICQs. Thank you for those comments. You guys are really great in the chat box. Thank you very much. Okay, and I'm a huge fan of red, yellow, and green lights. Okay, this traffic light activity. So you can cut out some red, yellow, red. You can be in any shape you want, and make sure all learners have them in the class. And if learners are a bit shy, they don't have to wave it. They can just place it on top of their desk. So if they place a red on top of their desk, that means they need help with this task and they can't do it without help. Okay. If you place yellow, they need help, but they can do a different part of the task while they wait. And green is, I'm okay, I don't need help with the task. Okay, so sometimes, we have, like I said earlier, these students, they can be disruptive because they feel maybe inadequate, their skill level, and this is a great way for them to be, taking initiative, right? So they're not requesting the teacher all the time, but requesting the teacher when they do need that level of help. Well, it could be as simple as red is, I don't understand, yellow is I kind of understand, and green is, I've got it. So very flexible with red, yellow, and green lights. Now, again, with this theme of, putting this responsibility to the learners, something that does come up is learners just not understanding. Okay, this is, with young learners, very young learners, they're still building that foundation in vocabulary. And so they encounter a lot of blocker words, or perhaps we've introduced the word and they just don't get it. And I find that giving the role of teacher to learners is sometimes an effective way around this. And you might ask learners to explain using different words, even drawing or even miming. And these are all little tools that learners can use to be the teacher and to effectively help explain. But that said, don't forget the power of a learner's native language. And I understand in some institutions, they're not very keen on using the native language. I worked in one of those. Back when I was teaching in Australia, I was teaching some Spanish-speaking students, and I wanted to show off. They were very low level. And I thought I'll show off on, I used my bag of tricks to teach the vocabulary, and we were doing a turtle. I think it was turtle or tortoise, and so I gave a definition explanation. It's an animal with a hard shell that walks, for instance, for example, slowly. And the students looked at me and were like, no. So I did a drawing, but I'm a little bit like Picasso, to take some time to understand my drawing. And the students looked at it and they said, no. So I looked around carefully to see if my director of studies was looking, and I just translated into Spanish. And the students instantly said, "Oh, I've got it." And that's a great example of why sometimes just use of L1 is more effective and direct method for communicating meaning. As teachers, we do have a set limit and time, so we have to make sure we use it to its best value. But of course, sometimes we just have naughty students. Okay, sometimes we might try these techniques to offer to assign roles, to make them more responsible for their learning, to even communicate and to have a better prepared lesson. Sometimes we're still going to encounter learners who have behavioral problems. And I find that out of the classes I've observed, we often get teachers who can become too strict. Okay, in a sense that this can negatively affect the learning process. Or oftentimes in the regions where I've worked, some of the regions I've worked, that teachers ignore these sort of students and say, well, I'm stuck with you. You're at the back. I'm going to focus on these students. And sort of ignoring these students doesn't help. Being overly strict also doesn't help. So you have to think is, how can we create that positive encouragement? Do we need to sit with the learner? Do we need to talk with them in private? Or is it simple as asking them how they're going? What do they need help with? Reaching out with that learner can often be the difference between a naughty student and just an active student in your lesson. So they're sort of difficult to provide one sort of answer for this, but you have to see what works in your context. But emotions are normal with learners. It's normal with us too. So you have to think, how can we better regulate these emotions with our learners? How can you help them to communicate what they're feeling in the lesson, or communicate how they feel about an activity or what's happened? And we could have a feeling better chart. So we might write on the board, okay, a chart of different emotions they might feel in our lesson. Maybe it's embarrassed, maybe it's bored, maybe they're worried, perhaps even upset or angry. We can write this up on the board or have it on a poster to the side. And we can make them write down how they feel at the end of the lesson, perhaps. And ask them, how did you feel during the lesson? Did you experience any of these sort of emotions that are on the chart? And you can give them some example actions that they can take to make themselves feel better. So if the learner's angry, you might notice it, and you can say, hey, you can take a deep breath. Okay, maybe you can take some time out of the lesson. All right. I was with a class recently, and it was a very young primary class, and they were doing an activity, and one of the kids knocked another kid. And the kid got angry. He was like, you knocked me. Okay, and quite upset. So I said, no, it's okay. You didn't mean to. And, just sit down, calm down. You can join the activity when you feel better. Okay, maybe they get embarrassed in the lesson. Maybe they made a mistake, and the other kids looked at them and they thought they were being laughed at. Okay, this is something, my daughter's very sensitive about this. In her extracurricular activities, if she feels she's embarrassed, she can be very upset. I just tell her, if this happens, maybe just move and get a new group if you can, or you can ask the teacher. When you get towards the end of your lesson, You also want to keep track of how the lesson's going with the learners, okay? And get them to recall what they have learned, okay? Get them to recall what was the original goals, okay? List what our aims were and see if we've met our outcomes, okay? And perhaps chart how well we've done. Okay, and at the end of each unit, you can ask the learners to look back, see the different activities that you've done throughout the lesson. And I like to do this at the beginning with a new class. And this way you can chart what activities they enjoy. So you get them to write, smiley face, middle face, or an angry face, across different sorts of activities or handouts. So you sort of get a feel for what the students enjoy, what maybe they have trouble with, or what activities engage them less. And of course, you could think about how many descriptive emotion little figures are suitable for your lesson. And you can also encourage them to explain their reasoning and why they've chosen certain emotions or attitudes to describe how they feel about activities. Okay, so here's some example ones. You don't have to use that many. Again, you can use however many as you feel is appropriate for your lesson. So I think with classroom management, it really comes down to how we can influence and affect our learners. And we do this by making the classroom an area where learners feel stimulated, engaged in activities that are appropriate for their age, interests, and cultural background. And most important, where they feel they can succeed. And I think this is really what we want in a successful lesson. And this makes all these little tools can ultimately help us with classroom management, which gets us to our end result of having a successful lesson. You might have noticed that I took a lot of these activities from the Cambridge ELT blogs. So oftentimes teachers like you that are listening tune in to these sessions and they forget all the great stuff that Cambridge offers. So if you want to find out more activities and ideas like this, check out cambridge.org ELT blog. And I got a lot of these ideas from the Cambridge Life Competencies Young Learners Activity Cards. I think they're a great resource. I use them in my lessons, and I hope you do too. And thank you guys for tuning in. Thank you for being really active in the chat.
Okay, Nick, we had a couple of questions in the Q&A box. Let me just pick one out. We have one from Julina. She says, at times I felt like I thoroughly prepared the lesson, but when I entered the class, everything does not go as planned. Or sometimes a lesson works well in one class, but an entirely disaster in another. Do you have any tips and thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think I like the last part. I think all of us have been there. When we've had a successful lesson, and we're like, I'm going to keep this lesson plan. And the next time we do it, it just goes up in a pile of smoke. And I think that goes back to that, where are we planning for the lesson or are we planning for the learners? And when we are doing our planning, we do have to think about, who are our learners, what's their learning profile, and how they work together, and this sort of builds together how we're planning. And of course, like I mentioned earlier, you don't want to be married to your lesson plan either. If you're doing an activity and you think it's great, but you get to it, maybe your learners they all get it instantly. is it worth doing that activity, or do you move to the next one? Or in the example where the person asked, maybe it's just not working well. I remember a trainer once said, you don't beat a dead horse dead. And I've always taken that to heart. If it's just not working, just move on. Okay. And sometimes if it is really bad, you call a timeout, take a break, regroup, and then see how you move on. And it could be a simple thing like, reordering where students sit. Okay. Or it might be sort of highlighting certain rules. Mm-hmm.
That's great. Okay, a next question by Alan. He says, regarding very young learners and young learners, do you think the functions of rules and routine can be deemed to serve the same purposes?
Yeah, that's a great question, Alan. I do think, there's an overlap with this, isn't there? Because with the routines, the sort of learners learn that structure, and with rules, they sort of know what to expect. Learners will always try and push boundaries. That's natural, but when you establish that routine, they get used to it. It's okay, but you don't want to make it stale either. They're like, okay, next is reading. And now we're going to do, the jumping activity. You don't want to do that either. You do want to allow some flexibility. Mm-hmm.
That's interesting. Another question from Fernando. He says, in what ways can the students take part in class management and help the teacher? And what are some advantages of this?
Oh, well, that's a great question, Fernando. I have had students who are quite talented, but you find that sometimes the clever students are also naughty because they're quite clever, and they sort of get distracted, or it's not challenging enough. I tend to give them some sort of role that they perceive as senior. Say, okay, you're the person, when you finish, you've got to make sure everyone's on task. And that's sort of empowering for them. So they get up and they can quickly patrol. And, sometimes these students are also a bit hyperactive, so it gets them up and moving as well. So we can tire them out a little bit. So yeah, I think, giving them an observational job, like that, making sure students are on task, or maybe you can give them a job where they're a timer as well. Okay. Any of these sort of roles are great, or helping you move things. Great question, Fernando.
And with the naughty students that you say, how can one deal with learners with serious behavioral issues? Any tips?
That's tricky, isn't it? Because what's appropriate might vary from region or country or culture to another. In a situation like that, what I think is that you have to follow your school's procedures. So for instance, if you are having serious behavioral problems with a learner, you might take them aside, privately communicate with them. If this behavior persists, you might give them a warning and say that, that's their last warning. The next, you're going to talk with the school's principal or director of studies or head of year group. And again, so you follow this procedure and you go there, and then it goes outside of your control at some point, and then it becomes, the management of the school's problem, and they might have to talk with parents. But I have been in situations in institutions where a problem was being drawn from outside, from family issues. And then in those sort of cases, you have to provide comfort and support to this learner. And that's where school counselors come in to provide that extra level of assistance to help these kids.
Yeah, I entirely agree. We have an anonymous question. It says, most of my students have low English proficiency. I had to repeat the classroom rules again and again through verbal explanations and written reminders, and still some just failed to follow them. She says, I teach a big class. What should I do so that I don't burn myself out while repeating and monitoring big classes? Any tips?
Thank you for that question. Yeah, with big classes, that it's quite difficult, especially with young learners and big classes. Classroom management gets a lot more complicated. So I can completely understand your situation. I think you've got to make sure that you're not burning out yourself. What do I mean by that? I mean, like, that you're not constantly raising your voice, constantly getting flustered. Okay, try and pause. Okay, offer some silence. A great trick I learned many years ago with my CELTA, and this always gets kids' attention. Quickly turn off the lights, on and off. They're all like sort of, yeah, it's like, you know, bugs in a headlight. They're all sort of like, what's happened? And it's a quick way to grab attention. And you also want to make sure that, you know, they get something that they want if they can comply. And, you know, and then the opposite is true, right? That there is some form of punishment for when they're not complying. You know, with young learners, it's easy. You know, you say, hey, there's a point system. Your group does well, you get more points, and you might get stickers. You know, so many stickers leads to some other thing. So you can have one like a reward system that might work, or alternatively, for the naughty students, you know, you can say, okay, if you get 3 warnings within so many classes, I'm going to talk to your parents. And usually with young learners, that's the fear of God, right?
I think so too. Okay, one other question. Have you ever experienced a situation in which you took over an existing class, which is difficult to manage? And if so, what can one do?
Yeah, if you're ever in the unfortunate situation of taking over a class midway through, particularly if it's a difficult class, it's never fun. And again, that's about bringing those routines in and establishing those rules, okay? And it's going to be a slow process, especially if you're coming into an established class, because they have that environment, they have that, you know, it's negative, but they still have it. So you've got to sort of re-establish rules and establish a positive cooperative environment. So it's a step-by-step process. It's not something that can come about quickly. So most of all, you need patience.
A lot of it. And I think on that note, that's all the time that we have for today. Please, can you put a big clap for Nick in the chat? That would be really, really great. Thank you again, Nick, for the wonderful session. I think everyone has gained a lot from you today.